of data from the 02906 area code from 2016 to 2018 that really described around 200 and something evictions and really went through the court cases.
Claire.
Oh, sorry about that. So to cover a bit of our background, we were covering just the changing forms of landlordism associated with tenant housing insecurity and clustering of evictions within our area code or our zip code, the 02906. We speculated a strong relationship between corporate landlordism and also housing stability among tenants, and then also have noticed that there's about several mappable evictions within the area. And based on this background, we formed the hypotheses that we were going to see, as we said, lots of clustering from the data set that we had, and that these were associated with absentee landlordism, corporate landlordism, and then select property management companies throughout the area.
So as Clara mentioned, we mapped, there were 143 mappable evictions in our data set. So these are two maps. On the left, you have the percent non-white by census block group with our evictions court case data layered over it. And then on the right, you have the number of non-white renters by block group. So there are two clusters. The first is in the Mount Hope area. And if you look west of Camp Street, you see a pretty clear divide on both maps, where to the east of Camp Street, it's whiter. To the west of Camp Street, there's a higher non-white population, and you have clustering of evictions to the west of Camp Street. I'd also like to highlight in the Eastern Fox Point area, there's an eviction court case cluster. And for that, there's a lower non-white population in that census block group, but very, very high non-white rentership in that area. So these two maps are percent change in non-white population by census block group. The first is from 2000 to 2018, and the second is based on American Community Survey estimates from 2009 to 2013, and then 2014 to 2018. So in both maps, you see displacement of people of color occurring in the Western Fox Point census block group, where there's the cluster of evictions, and also in the Mount Hope area. So we identified 3 census block groups, which had a high amount of evictions in them. So these 3 census block groups comprise 9% of the 02906 population, 14% of all renters in 02906, 21% of all non-white renters in 02906, and 39% of evictions. So the first is census block group, I'm just gonna say the last 4 digits, 2004. And this is in the northern Mount Hope area. It had the most eviction cases in 02906. And based on American Community Survey estimates, the median rent increased 29% in the 5 years prior to 2018. So we hypothesize that that's something that is driving a lot of these evictions. This block group is 3% of the population and 15% of all evictions in 02906. So here, this block group is directly south of block group 2004. It's the only majority non-white block group in 02906 by residency. And the rent increased 18% in this block group in the 5 years prior to 2018. So it appears that there's a similar situation going on here. This block group represents 4% of the 02906 population and 13% of all evictions in 02906. And then finally, we have the block group in Western Fox Point. This block group had the most non-white renters of any block group in 02906, despite having a relatively low non-white population and just a low population in general. This is one of the smallest block groups in 02906 by population. The rent only increased 2% in this area in the 5 years prior to 2018. And we hypothesized that one reason why we're seeing a lot of evictions in this area is this is an area where students from Brown are starting to rent more and more housing, and they're encroaching on this area. We are encroaching on this area. So we hypothesized that could be a factor in why there's so many evictions there. So we also did a bit of looking into other data surrounding why these evictions might be taking place. One thing we did was we went through the Providence tax assessor database to match owners at different addresses to see if they reside at the address that they filed the eviction in. We found that 46% of landlords in eviction court cases were absentee, and 26 we could determine were not absentee. There was also the rest of them, the other 28% we could not determine, and that was either due to a mistake in data entry at some point, or they had sold the house and the tax assessor data was no longer available, or a number of other reasons. And that's among individual landlords. And we also found 65% of all plaintiffs in eviction court cases had zip codes outside of 02906. We also studied corporate landlordism in the area. And we also use the tax assessor database to try and track down who really owned what property. A lot of landlords use LLCs or corporations to own their properties. This shields them from their information being public, but also from legal liability in a lot of cases. So we found certain cases where a landlord had owned a house, and then 1 year they sold it for $0 to an LLC. And then all of a sudden we couldn't look at where that landlord lives. And so we found that in many cases, landlords are hiding that information or using LLCs to cover that information. And then lastly, we found the eviction clusters that we showed on the maps occur in predominantly non-white neighborhoods with histories of displacement. And we hypothesize that this is tied to rising cost of rent and studentification.
So for our next steps, we have a few things in mind. On the research end, we want to first expand the data set from on the front end from 2014 to 2015, so we can get a broader sense of what's going on, and then on the other side from 2019 to 2020. And like AJ talked about earlier, we don't really always have a sense of what happened when, because ownership can be transferred from one person to an LLC, so then we lose a face. And in another case, we saw that a realty company have owned properties for about 2 years and then sell the properties. And in a 2-year period, they had evicted 6 or 7 different times on the spreadsheet, but we couldn't see them on the tax assessor database anymore. We also want more individual research on individual landlords and qualitative study for the court documents, really meaning that we want to have a better understanding of what was going on in a sense. And this kind of speaks to our limitations for not being in Providence, because we couldn't get as much of a hold on who's actually getting evicted and really talk to the people involved. And then lastly, we want to find out more about Brown's expansion to the jury districts. And for a few areas of actions, we really want to make sure that this doesn't stop at a simple report. We want to make sure that tenants understand their rights and get the proper education to organize. There's canvassing that we have canvassing going on, so people can understand where evictions are happening and really get an idea of what the brevity of it, like what informal evictions are happening, and then we want to really go into more policy solutions and find other innovative solutions.
So that's what we have right now. Professor Ritchie, I don't know if you want to do questions now or at the end.
Yeah, let's do some questions now. We have a few minutes to do some questions. So anybody can, at this point, have the questions they have for the group.
Okay. This is Andy Kagan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. I know till the pandemic struck and the students had to leave and the courts shut down, they'll start reopening May 18th or 17th, excuse me. Are there any plans to, in the future, to see what happens in 6th Division Court so you get a better understanding of what the tenants' needs are?
Yeah, so we currently don't have plans to do that. One thing we talked about that we think will be really important is we anticipate once the courts open up, there's going to be a lot of eviction filings and things along those lines. Obviously, there's a lot of people who have lost their incomes and can't pay rent right now. And so we as a group were talking and felt like it would be really important that that is tracked and watched as it happens. But we don't have any formal plans right now.
Okay. And how, I mean, obviously when you go through the judicial records, that doesn't state the race of the defendant, the tenants. So did I misunderstand you, or do you have any knowledge of how many of the people or percentage of the people actually were people of color?
So we don't know that the people evicted were people of color. What we do know is that evictions are occurring at a much higher rate in areas where people of color reside and where there are higher numbers of renters of color. You're right, we don't have access to racial data regarding court proceedings, but we do know that it's clustered in neighborhoods that are both historic and current neighborhoods of color.
Right. And also, do you have any data on the percentage of evictions in these 02906 clusters versus the evictions elsewhere in Providence?
Yeah, so evictions occur at a much, much lower rate. I don't have specific numbers, but they occur at a much, much lower rate in 02906 than other zip codes. And one thing that we think is really important is that there are further studies with similar methodology to this, where you're mapping evictions and plotting it out, that occur in other areas of Providence, and specifically with regards to Brown's impact in the jewelry district, since the development there will certainly impact the surrounding rental market.
All right. Just as an aside, if your successors or you want to work with me, because I do a lot of landlord-tenant work, I'd be glad to assist you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have a couple of more minutes, actually not. So, but does anybody else have another question?
This is Keith Stokes. Just two questions. How do you define communities of color? I hear that a lot, but what does that actually mean? Who is that? Are there breakdowns, ethnic breakdowns? What does that mean?
So I think there is a bit of conflation in our data of areas that are historically areas of color. So you have the Fox Point and Mount Hope neighborhoods, where there's a long history of Cape Verdean communities, African-American communities residing there. And the census data that we have, which is kind of just a flat statistical breakdown of, you know, non-white population, people who responded to the census and marked non-white. And, you know, obviously we can't reconcile those two things with hard numbers. What we can do is look at the data and make judgments as to where it is, as to what we're seeing. And I think one thing we saw was that evictions continue to occur in areas that are both historical neighborhoods of color and areas that where people of color currently reside.
So I guess my follow-up to that is, because I was reading the statement, the eviction clusters, predominantly non-white neighborhoods. It's tied to rising costs of rent and studification, but is there any assessment of the socioeconomic status of the tenants themselves?
Of the tenants themselves?
Yes. Is there any understanding or recognition of what their socioeconomic status might be, particularly at the time of eviction?
I mean, we don't have hard data on people who are specifically evicted in terms of their socioeconomic status. What we do have is data on the census block groups and the neighborhoods.
We didn't actually have the names of the people evicted. We had more so the evictors and just information on who the plaintiffs were. And that was like we talked about earlier. That was one of the limitations, that the data that we had was about how the plaintiff filed, but not specifically what the court proceedings are, specifically who showed up to court, or about like what the inner workings of like qualitative data was.
I think that we could probably look at the closest we could do is if we did a census block and we looked at the income of that census block. That might give us some idea, except that it's not as fine-grained as block census data, but it is something to consider, and it will be able to think more about that in future. Thank you so much, AJ and Jamil, and let's move on because we're going to get tight in time and love to have some more questions at the end.